So my thesis title is Deformation and Fracture Behavior of Transparent Wood Polymer Biocomposites. So I will start by introducing what is transparent wood and why we investigated deformation and fracture behavior, and also showing some significant results and conclusions of my work. But I will leave some of the technical details for the discussion later. So optical transparent materials is something which is quite important for us. We use it in our buildings. It makes our buildings more energy efficient. We don't need to use as much light sources if we can utilize the daylight more. We also use it in advanced technologies like solar cells, transparent electronics. So they are very important in our daily life. And the common materials that we use are glass, polymers, transparent composites. However, when it comes to transparent composites, most of those are fossil-based. So in order to make something which is more towards sustainable development, we would like to work with something with a renewable resource, like wood. So we can make wood composites. To just introduce how wood looks like, so it is an anisotropic structure. The fibers are aligned in the growth or the height direction of the tree. The fibers are, like I said, it's naturally aligned, so the nature has built this material for us. It can be made transparent, and like I said, it's sustainable development. Well, we know that the wood is not transparent, but we can make it transparent. So one of the reasons why wood is not transparent is because of light scattering effects. So wood is quite a porous material. So some species could have up to 95% of porosity inside. So in theory, we can make it transparent if we fill these pore volumes with a matrix or any material that matches the refractive index and it's itself transparent. In practice, of course, may not work just only by filling it. So one of the reasons is because there are some compounds in the material or in wood that actually absorbs light, and for example, lignin. So one idea is then we take the wood veneer, we remove the lignin by doing the lignification, and then we fill the pores with the polymer. And then we can make it transparent. I can show here the difference between the two. So you can have a transparent material and sort of a translucent material without the lignification. And so this is a fairly new material that has not been investigated for many years. There are similar wood composites like this one where we don't do the lignification, but the investigation of the mechanical properties are a bit scarce. So we need to have a better understanding of how this material works if we want to use it in applications like rooftops, interior, or solar cells. And the wood structure is quite complex because of its anisotropy. So it's important that we investigate these materials in the perspective of continuum mechanics and fracture theories, similar to what one does for common composites. So these are the objectives of this study. Investigate the deformation and fracture behavior, also look at how the structure affects the properties, determine the different properties like elastic, strength, fracture toughness, and also want to develop an appropriate method for investigating this type of composites. So the agenda of the day is divided in 3 parts. So I will start by introducing the mechanical behavior of the material, the transparent wood. We will then explore the procedure, the more appropriate procedure to identify orthotropic properties of this composite. And lastly, then investigate the fracture mechanisms of transparent wood. starting with the first one. So we do lamination so that we did lamination so we can reduce the anisotropy of the material. So if you don't do any lamination, then the material is from a single ply, it's orthotropic. So by doing lamination, we reduce the anisotropy. In the first study, we used balsa wood, which is the low density. It has almost around 95% porosity. And we impregnated with the PMMA. In order to improve the mechanical properties, we compressed the wood veneer. So we could have a more volume fraction of the reinforcement. So we did mechanical tests in, one can say, the longitudinal direction. And you can see that the single ply is, and the laminates are quite the same. The strength is a bit better for the single ply. When we do it in the transverse direction, you can see that the single ply is much worse than the laminates. But the laminates still have similar properties. So it becomes more isotropic in the plane. And here are the values. So you can see that it's quite the same for the laminate in both directions. We also did check the transparency, the effect of anisotropy for light scattering. So you can see for single ply, it's quite narrow and oriented in the transverse direction, while for the laminate, it becomes more homogeneous in all directions, although we lose some transmittance. When we do compression of the wood template, we are basically collapsing the cell walls. So we want to investigate another method for improving or for increasing the volume fraction of reinforcement by not doing any compression. And so in paper 2, we used birch, which is a higher density wood than balsa. So what we do then, we can look at microscopy how this two material looks like. So you can see that by doing the lignification, we don't destroy the wood structure; it's still intact. And then we can add PMMA to both of these composites, and then we get these two types of composites: one which is more translucent, one which is more, well, the transparent wood, with the improved optical properties. Right. So we know that the material, the single ply, is orthotropic. So for us to investigate the elastic properties or the strength properties, we need to do 3 tests in order to get all of those properties needed to describe the material in plane. We also use strain measurements to see how it deforms. We deposit a speckle pattern on top of on the surface of the specimen, and we then use algorithms to track those patterns. And by doing that, we could see from the transverse direction that if we include a polymer matrix, we're actually reducing the strain inhomogeneity in the field. And we are localizing the strains much more, as you can see from this one. So you can see the localized point where it actually fractured in the end. In the longitudinal direction, we have quite a linear behavior up till failure, and then there's a brittle failure. So when you look at the videos and the images, there is no direct evidence for when it breaks. So there's a brittle failure of this material. What we can see by doing the lignification, we have an interesting reinforcement effects. We have a better elastic modulus and a better strength of this material. We can look at this reinforcement effect by using rule of mixture. And then we can see that actually the reinforcement becomes much higher for the lignified birch than compared to native birch. So the reinforcement effect is huge, which in some sense could be a bit non-intuitive, since we're reducing the porosity by doing the lignification. So we believe that adding a polymer improves the stress transfer. You can also see from the strain fields. the content of cellulose is much higher in the delignified birch. Now, if you do the same thing but in transverse direction, we can see that there's a drastic increase in elastic properties. So adding a polymer is better for the elastic properties, and the same thing for the strength. Same here, we get a brittle fracture with quite a linear behavior until fracture. So conclusion of part 1 or part A is that we can use lamination to reduce anisotropy. We have a better reinforcement effects by choosing the lignified birch, and the polymer, adding a polymer reduces the in-plane anisotropy. But we have a brittle failure. So this failure mechanisms is what we will investigate in the end, in part C. So the second one, now we're gonna look at the method for, instead of doing 3 tests to characterize this material, we would like to use 1. So we could postulate material models to describe the linear behavior, but also if there is a non-linear behavior. So for this method, we will use wood fiber composites. So we take a wood fiber composite with a random orientation, and before making the material, we could introduce an orientation to the fibers, so it becomes orthotropic. And if we do an off-axis tensile test, we can see that there is a linear behavior in the beginning, which translates to a non-linear behavior. We can take the strain field measurements with the camera and investigate how it deforms. We can do the same thing in finite element or a model to describe this kind of behavior. And then we take the difference between those 2 strain fields. And from that, we can choose to take strain fields from the elastic part to identify the elastic properties. And then we can do the same thing for the nonlinear part, where we can identify plastic model parameters. And this is done by updating the finite element until this difference map is minimized. And then we can see that the finite element model actually predicts very well with the experiments. And of course, we need to validate this. So we did other tests in different directions, and we can see how well it actually performed. So we are quite close to the experimental values. Now, if we can use the strain fields to also check the inhomogeneity in this type of material. If we take strain field plots from the same average strain, we can see that there's a lot of inhomogeneity in the strain fields. So, and if we look at specifically those very dark red regions, which are the regions where it actually will fail later, you can see that there is a fracture of the fibers on the surface. So we have weak regions which fails, and these are the main reasons why we have this kind of nonlinear behavior of this type of material. Now we can also compare this by disintegrating the fibers even further, so we get a more finer structure with the nano-sized fibers. So these are micro-sized and these are nano-sized. And then we can see that we are actually reducing the inhomogeneity of this composite. However, we can see that in the longitudinal direction for this material, we can see that we have quite the same or similar behavior. Although this one, the nano-sized fibers have a larger, higher strength. By doing this integration, this requires a lot of energy for making the material, and there is less energy that we need for orienting the material. So oriented wood fiber composites are, in that sense, more sustainable than the nano-sized fiber composites. So we have seen that we can use this finite element updating procedure to identify the properties, both nonlinear and linear, for nonlinear material behavior. We can see that using strain field measurements and also microscopy, we can, together with them, identify what is the reason for these localized weak regions in the strain field. And using oriented wood fiber composites are more sustainable than nano-sized wood fiber composites. Now, in the last part, we want to investigate the fracture mechanisms in transparent wood and wood-polymer composites. But we can utilize these strain field measurements so that we can identify the elastic properties of this material and also the fracture properties by doing one test. So we can utilize what we learned from part B. And specifically here, we want to look at actually these localized points. What are the reasons why it fractures? Why does it look like this? And we will compare native birch PMMA, and the lignified birch PMMA composite. Just establish, for the sake of this presentation, I want to establish the fracture terminology. So wood, as I said, is an anisotropic material. There's a complex way of how a crack can propagate through wood. There are 8 different types of way how it can propagate. But we will focus here on the weakest one, which is called TL. So the crack is propagating along the fibers, but loaded in transverse direction. And then the strongest, where the crack is trying to propagate through the fibers. So if we compare these to different types of fracture behavior, we can see that splitting the fiber when the crack is growing along the fiber direction, the fracture toughness is quite low compared to the other direction where you have to propagate through the fibers. And this is one of the reasons why splitting wood is so much easier than cutting through the fibers. We usually use machines to get this clean cut. So how we will investigate this material is by doing 4-point bending. We will initiate a sharp crack with a laser and a razor knife. And the reason why we use small, thin specimens is because this material is not made on industrial scale. We're making it ourselves. It's quite new to the So to identify the elastic and fracture properties, we need to postulate material models. So we postulate a linear elastic orthotropic behavior, as we learned before in the Tensile test, and then a cohesive zone model to model the fracture process zone. So an example of that is that we, for example, in the weakest direction where the crack is growing along the fiber direction, used in paper 3, the cohesive model is basically initiated when the stress level at the crack tip reaches a critical cohesive strength. And this is where the cohesive zone is basically separating the surfaces, and until there is a complete separation where it fails. And the region for this model is basically the fracture energy that is dissipated. Like I said, we can use the strain field measurements. We can compare with from experiment, we can compare it with the finite element model. And we minimize the difference between those two to identify the properties. So first elastic and then the fracture properties. Looking at the weakest direction. If we do this 4-point bending test inside of an SCM or a microscopy, we can see that there's an intercellular fracture. So this type of fracture is occurring in the material. And by looking at the strain field measurements, we can see by adding a polymer, we actually are making the material much more homogeneous, or the strain field becomes much more homogeneous. and we localize the stress and strain to the fracture process zone, the crack tip. And we can see that there is a decrease, because of that, there is a decrease in fracture energy. During the lignification, we drastically reduce the fracture energy, but also the cohesive strength. Right, now if we look at the strongest direction, so in literature, there's seldom a case where the crack is actually growing straight. It will grow in a snake-like pattern, like you see here. But we want to investigate the strongest direction. So in order for us to do that, we are cutting a groove in the middle or close to in the direction of where the crack should propagate. And this is to basically stop the crack in its track. So if we look at the top view here, so this is how we made the cross section. We used a saw to create this groove. And from microscopy, we can see that the crack is actually growing from a microscopic scale in a straight manner. However, there's a large fracture process zone where there's a lot of fiber pull-up mechanisms. Reasons for why it's so strong in that direction. By using cohesive models, we can identify the properties. We can see that by adding a polymer, we have an increase in fracture energy, a drastic increase in fracture energy, and also the strength. During the lignification, there is not much difference in fracture energy, some difference in the cohesive strength. But more importantly is that comparing this with the weakest direction is about 300 times larger, which is quite amazing. Compared to literature that have done some similar type of tests, and not the same geometry, of course, they get roughly the same numbers as we are. So we are in the right region. One study that have studied the lignified balsa epoxy composites, they estimated a much lower fracture energy, but they also observed this crack deflection. So in their experiment, the crack path was not straight, and this is quite common in the literature when you read about wood, that the crack does not actually grow in a straight manner. But we want to investigate why it is not. Why is not the crack path straight? So I use the same specimen setup as before, as for the weakest direction. We initiate the crack with the laser cut, and we subject it to a load, and we can see directly that there's a crack propagation along the fiber direction. So we can use strain field measurements, and we can investigate what's actually going on in the strain field. So we can see then at the crack tip, tensile strains are building up, promoting the crack to deflect along the fiber direction. In order for us to understand what's actually going on around the crack, we can postulate the cohesive zone models in the direction where we know that the crack is propagating from experiments, but also in the direction from where we want the crack to grow. And then we can match those fields together. Doing that, we can then learn what's actually making the material or making the crack to grow along the fiber direction. We can see that the stresses at the fracture process zone are exceeding critical cohesive tensile strength of the weakest direction. And this is the one that promotes this crack deflection. And the stresses in the straight direction, LT direction, then you see that the stresses are far from actually reaching these critical values. So that's why there's no crack propagation. So conclusion of this part C, we developed methods for appropriate methods for investigating these type of materials and the fracture properties. We could learn from strain field measurements what happens with by adding a polymer. An interesting thing here is that adding a polymer decreases the fracture energy in the weakest direction, but it also increases the fracture energy in the strongest direction. So there are pros and cons for adding a polymer. And then the lignification lowers the intercellular fracture. So the peeling of the cell wall becomes much easier by doing the lignification. And then we could learn why the crack is actually not going in the strongest direction. So outlook of this thesis is that we learn what happens when we do the lignification. It weakens the intercellular fracture properties. We learn what happens when we add a polymer and what happens to the strain fields. We developed the methods, appropriate methods for investigating these properties and also the mechanical behavior. And it was useful to both use finite element updating and strain field measurements together to better understand these materials. So what I suggest for future work are checking what happens when we add other polymer systems, and if we investigate the interfacial properties between the polymer and the cell wall. And of course, other wood species, what happens to the fracture pattern for those, and can we increase the volume fracture even further by using higher density woods? And another important deformation mechanisms that would be suggested to work with is creep. So what happens on the load during a long time? So I would like to acknowledge my supervisors, my collaborators, Chiliang, Celine, Marcus, Erfan Lengwan, and of course my colleagues at Biocomposites and also the solid mechanics, since I've been sort of in between the two departments here. And of course my funding agency, the ERC. Thank you.